She moved into the place nobody wanted, carrying her fever-burning daughter in her arms and dragging her barefoot boy by the hand, after being humiliated at the doors of the village church in front of everyone. Can you imagine what it's like to need help so badly that you walk into a church, your clothes still damp with sweat and dust, asking only for a sip of water and a look of care, only to be told in front of the whole town that you bring misfortune, that you are unwelcome, and that you should go back the way you came? But this story actually happened on a stifling afternoon on August 17th, 1891, in the small settlement of St. Benedict's Crossing, deep in the rocky badlands of the West, when a widow named Claire experienced a life-altering turn of events because of a door that almost closed and a man who stood up from the back pew. Before we continue this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button down below, because the ending of this narrative will show you that, sometimes, it only takes one person standing up for us to change not just a destiny, but the entire course of a community that had been living with its eyes shut. What this woman found in that place everyone called cursed didn't just change her future and that of her children. It forced the town of St. Benedict's Crossing to face ancient secrets buried in the church stones and the forgotten promises of a vanished priest. And tell me in the comments which city you're watching this story from, because it's always moving to know how far these tales from our frontier travel and in which corner of the world your heart is listening to this voice. On that August afternoon in 1891, the heat seemed to rise from the cracked ground as if the earth were breathing fire and exhaustion. Red dust kicked up with every step Claire took, coming down the dirt road with her cotton dress clinging to her body with sweat, a worn kerchief tied around her head, and feet punished by cracks that stung with every pebble. In her left arm, she clutched little Rose, 4 years old, against her chest. The child was half fainted from fever, her face flushed and hair matted to her forehead. With her right hand, she pulled along young Michael, 8 years old, too thin for his age, with sunken eyes and trousers that were far too short, struggling to keep pace with his mother while the 3 o'clock sun scorched the backs of their necks. The settlement of St. Benedict's Crossing appeared ahead as a handful of adobe and timber houses scattered around a small white church with a single tower, erected atop a small rocky knoll. From where the iron bell usually called the folk to Sunday morning mass, Anna arrived in that town after losing almost everything. A few months prior, she was still living at the White Lake Ranch, the property of Colonel Silas Thorne, her father-in-law, a man with a thick mustache and a booming voice who ruled over nearly everything in that slice of the frontier. Anna's husband, Jacob Thorne, worked as the colonel's trusted ranch foreman, knowing every trail and every shallow creek bed where, when it rained, water would hold for a while. They lived in a small tenant house made of timber and clay, atop a small hill overlooking the corral, the yard, and further off the thin line of the reservoir that was almost always half empty. Life was simple, hard, but it had a rhythm of normalcy. Anna woke before the sun to light the wood stove, strain weak coffee through a well-worn cloth, prepare corn grits with a little lard or butter when they had it, then get Michael ready to help with small chores around the house and look after Rose, who was still too small for any real work. Everything began to unravel on an afternoon in May of that same year, when the sky, which had promised rain for days with heavy clouds on the horizon, decided to dump its water all at once. The packed dirt ground turned into thick mud, the paths became slick, and Jacob received an order to take the ox wagon to fetch some sacks of supplies left at the Colonel's cronies' general store on the other side of a rocky incline. Anna remembered well the tightness in her chest when she saw her husband adjusting his leather hat, checking the yokes on the oxen, and saying almost jokingly that he'd be back before dark with the salt, sugar, and orders the Colonel had sent for. She offered him a piece of dry cloth to wipe his face, asked him to be careful on the slope, remarked that the rain had been coughing down too hard the last few days, and that the clay near the rocks was treacherous. He laughed, saying he'd faced those roads since he was a boy, that he knew where every rock hid beneath the water, and gave her a quick kiss on the forehead before pulling away. The news of the accident arrived as the sun was going down, painting the sky a sad orange that seemed to announce something terrible. One of the ranch hands appeared running, breathless, shirt sticking to his body, and sought out Anna with a look that betrayed despair before words even left his mouth. He recounted between broken sentences that the wagon had skidded on the descent of the slope, that a wheel slipped on a piece of slick rock covered in mud, and the cart overturned, dragging Jacob with it. They said her husband was pinned under the weight of the axle and the soaked sacks, that they heard a short scream, and that when they managed to lift the load off him, there was nothing left to be done. Anna still ran to the spot, her legs heavy as if someone had tied weights to her feet, and saw her husband's body laid out on the side of the road, face bruised, shirt torn from the drag, his hat fallen yards away, covered in mud. The wake took place that very night, in the simple room of the tenant house, with Jacob's body laid on a table improvised from planks. A sheet that once covered the couple's bed spread over him, and a few candles trembling in the darkness, casting strange shadows on the mud walls. The smell of wax mixed with sweat, wet earth and tears formed a heavy air, difficult to breathe. Neighbors and some ranch hands came to pray the rosary, murmuring words of comfort that barely reached Anna's ears as she sat in a corner with Michael leaning against her side, and Rose sleeping in her arms, unaware of what was happening. Colonel Silas Thorne appeared after a while, entered without taking off his hat, looked from a distance at his son's body, made a sloppy sign of respect, and turned to face Anna. His expression mixed grief with accusation. He spoke with that thick voice that filled the room, saying Jacob was one of his best men, that he had died due to carelessness, and that certain things only happened when a house wasn't in order, when there were too many loose tongues behind the walls. Anna felt the accusation hidden in those words, though he hadn't said it directly, and lowered her eyes, holding back tears so as not to collapse in front of everyone. In the days that followed, Anna's life began to shrink. Without her husband, there was no guaranteed wage, and little by little, the spontaneous help dried up. In the first month, the colonel still sent a sack of beans, one of flour and a tin of lard to help the daughter-in-law and grandkids, but that goodwill carried the weight of a debt. He walked around the ranch with his chin held high, repeating to anyone who would listen that he couldn't carry the world on his back, that a single woman needed to find her way, that he had no obligation to support those who no longer contributed to the work. Anna tried to get by washing clothes for the other women on the ranch and for the main house, spending hours with her hands submerged in the cold water of the trough, soaping, scrubbing, wringing, and hanging heavy sheets on the line while the sun burned her neck and the skin of her arms. At night, she sewed by the weak light of an oil lamp, patching children's clothes, sewing buttons on shirts, hemming skirts, all for a few cents that came in every now and then. Even so, food began to run scarce. Anna started dividing the already counted beans into smaller portions, leaving the children's plates a little fuller and hers thinner, inventing excuses saying she wasn't hungry, that she'd eaten earlier, that she needed to save it for the next day. The children's clothes wore thin at the knees, broken sandals were replaced by bare feet on the hot earth. The weight of loneliness hit hardest at night, when the wind whistled through the cracks of the poorly sealed wooden window, and the empty space in the bed seemed to scream Jacob's absence. In those moments, Anna remembered his laugh, the way he came in from work smelling of sweat and leather, tossed his hat in a corner, and pulled Michael over to show him some novelty, like a piece of wood carved into a horse, while giving a lingering kiss to Rose, who was already half asleep. The breaking point came on a dry morning when the sky looked like metal and the air cut the lungs, it was so hot. The colonel sent for her at the main house. She entered the parlour with its cool floor, where the smell of strong coffee and new leather mingled, and found Silas Thorne sitting in a high-backed chair, his thick fingers tapping slowly on the wooden armrest. He got straight to the point. He said the ranch could no longer support mouths that didn't contribute, that the mourning period had passed, that the world was hard on those who didn't pull themselves up, and that she had until the end of the week to vacate the cottage where she lived. He also spoke with a half-smile that hardened his face even further, that he knew of folk saying that ever since she arrived, a heavy cloud hung over the ranch, that the rain came at the wrong time, that cattle got hurt for no reason, that Jacob's accident had been a message from above. Anna listened to everything in silence, her heart hammering in her chest, without the courage to argue, because even the walls seemed to be on his side. She left the main house with blurred eyes, but the tears only fell when she closed the flimsy door of her home and saw herself alone, staring at the few belongings scattered about. 2 dented pots, some chipped plates, a sleeping mat, a frayed blanket, the small wooden trunk where she kept their few clothes. In the following days, she tried everything. She knocked on the door of an old acquaintance in another part of the ranch, heard a withered apology, justifying that her husband wouldn't accept someone frowned upon by the colonel living there. She went to speak with a distant relative on her mother's side who lived on another homestead, and heard that the drought was tightening, that one more mouth would be the weight that sank everyone. She sought out the small settlement of Old Jatoba, a few leagues away, and left with empty promises and looks of pity that didn't transform into anything concrete. With every door that closed, Anna felt as if the world was getting smaller, until, on a morning when she gathered the little she had in a cloth sack, tied it to her back, and told Michael to hold his sister's hand, she decided to follow the dirt road toward the town of St. Benedict's Crossing, where there was a white church she only knew by reputation, a general store with a tiled roof and a few houses. She thought that if she couldn't find a home, perhaps she would find at least a little compassion. Michael walked beside her with short steps, trying to keep up, while the sun climbed and made the air shimmer above the ground. The boy didn't complain, but every now and then he squeezed his mother's hand tighter, as if he wanted to make sure she was still there. Rose, in her arms, began to get hotter than normal, her face flushed and her body too limp. At first, Anna thought it was just the heat of the walk, but soon she realized the girl's eyes had a strange, clouded shine, and her breathing was coming faster. When they finally spotted the tower of the little white church rising above the adobe houses, Anna felt a mix of relief and urgency. The bell wasn't ringing at that hour, but she knew by the position of the sun that the afternoon would still be long, and that if she didn't get some help for her daughter, she might not have another chance. The square in front of the church was a patch of packed dirt with a few twisted trees offering scant shade, a wooden bench near the main door, and a wooden cross darkened by time planted in a corner. A few women chatted in small groups, wearing dark dresses, headscarves and rosaries wrapped around their fingers. 2 men leaned against their horses, further away, exchanging low words and spitting on the ground, while a boy kicked stones from one side to the other. Upon noticing Anna's figure approaching from the road, with her simple clothes and the bundle tied to her back, the women stopped talking for a second, as if holding their breath, and then resumed in whispers that passed from ear to ear. One of the men, noting her presence, widened his eyes slightly, recognizing the face of the widow from White Lake Ranch, and tilted his head to murmur something to his companion, who narrowed his gaze, curious. Inside the church, one could feel the rare coolness of thick walls painted white, contrasting with the heat outside. The floor of worn red tiles told silent stories of footsteps, prayers, and wakes that had happened there. Rows of heavy wooden pews lined up to the simple altar, where a statue of Saint Benedict, with a serene face and hands raised in blessing, watched everything from a small niche lit by 2 candles. In the last pew, set back in the shadows, a man of about 40-something, with a worn straw hat resting on the seat beside him, calloused hands resting on his knees and eyes cast down, seemed to be praying in silence, or perhaps just thinking about his own life. It was Joseph Joe Wright, a carpenter who went from town to town, fixing wooden bridges, stuck doors, windows without hinges, and church pews that creaked too much. When Anna stepped onto the square, she felt the dust stick to her ankles and a weakness rise up her legs, as if at any moment she might collapse right there in the middle of the hot dirt. She brought her daughter's face close to hers, felt the intense heat coming from the girl's skin, and on an impulse of someone with nowhere left to run, quickened her pace toward the church door. Michael accompanied her, holding her arm tighter now, his eyes peeking at the simple grandeur of that building he had never seen up close. When they reached the first step of the entrance, Anna took a deep breath, adjusted Rose's weight in her arms, wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, and began to climb the small stone staircase. That was when Mrs. Eudora, a middle-aged woman known throughout the town for being at the forefront of prayers, novenas, and church upkeep, planted herself right in front of the door, rosary hanging from her wrist, dark dress pressed crisp, and a white scarf covering her hair. She had the squinting eyes of someone accustomed to looking at the world, evaluating who deserved to enter and who should stay outside. Upon seeing Anna, her countenance hardened even more. With an almost automatic gesture, she stretched out her arm, as if to block the way, and asked dryly what that woman wanted there, at that hour, with children in that state. Anna, her voice choked and hoarse, explained that her daughter had a high fever, that they had walked a long way under the sun, that she only wanted a glass of water, some shade, and, if possible, for the priest to pray a blessing for the girl. As she spoke, some people who were in the square began to approach, curious, forming a small semicircle some distance from the stairs. Mrs. Eudora wrinkled her nose, as if she smelled something unpleasant. She asked, in a tone that mixed religiosity and venom, if Anna wasn't that widow from Colonel Silas Thorne's ranch, the one people said caused things to go awry since she set foot there, cattle dying, rain coming at the wrong time, and even the boss's son losing his life tragically. Her lips curled into an almost invisible smile when some people murmured "That's her, all right," confirming the suspicion. Anna felt her face burn not just from the sun, but from shame. She tried to answer that things weren't like that tragedies happen, that she never wished harm on anyone, but her voice came out too weak, almost swallowed by the hot air. The church lady then raised her chin and spoke louder so everyone could hear. She said that the house of God was a place of peace, that certain presences there could bring spiritual weight, that one needed to be zealous with sacred things. She commented, without saying the colonel's name, that she respected too much the man who supported that parish to go against what everyone knew, that sometimes God spoke through signs, and that the signs around that woman were not good. She suggested Anna go look for help somewhere else, perhaps at a relative's house, perhaps on the road, but not to bring into the church problems that, according to her, came from afar and brought shadow with them. Michael, hearing this, squeezed his mother's hand even tighter, his chest rising and falling fast. Rose let out a weak whimper in her arms, body burning. Inside, in the last pew, Joe Wright heard the change in tone of the voices and raised his face, curious. He had learned over the years to recognize by the way people spoke when injustice was happening, even if no one used the word. Mrs. Eudora's words resonated in the nave of the church, as if someone was slamming a door in the face of those who needed it most. The memory hit his chest like a stone. Years ago, in another place, he too had seen people left outside in the rain, while inside they prayed for souls already saved. He closed his eyes for a second, as if fighting something within himself, then took a deep breath, pushing his hands against his knees to stand up. Anna, outside, felt her body waver. For an instant, she thought about turning around, going down the steps, and leaving even without knowing where to. The shame of all those eyes weighed like bags of stones hanging from her neck. She almost gave in to the urge to apologize for bothering them, to say it had been a mistake, that she didn't know what she was doing. But then she felt the heat of Rose's body almost burning her arms, heard a sob stuck in Michael's throat as he tried to be strong, and something inside her refused to accept that closed door. With a trembling voice, but firm enough to cut through the silence of the square, she said she knew she wasn't worth much in their eyes, that she had no land, no strong name, no living husband to defend her, but that her daughter had just as much right as any other child to receive a blessing and a bit of water. She said that if God looked at who enters the church by the size of the house they live in, then it wasn't worth being inside. The silence that followed these words was heavy. Some people lowered their eyes, ashamed on the inside, even if on the outside they remained motionless. Others shifted, uncomfortable, as if the bench they were sitting on had suddenly become too hard. Mrs. Eudora squeezed the rosary even tighter in her hand, jaw locked, and prepared another cutting retort, something to put Anna back in the place she had come from. Before she could speak, however, a noise coming from inside the church broke the mood, the creak of the last pew being dragged backward. Joe Wright appeared in the doorway a few seconds later. He was a man of medium height, broad shoulders of someone who spent a life carrying lumber and tools, skin darkened by the sun and the dust of the roads, brown hair already peppered with white strands near the temples. His stubble was a few days past the perfect line, giving him a tired but not unkempt look. His eyes, a deep dark brown, held a sad shine, as if they guarded more memories than he could tell in a whole night of conversation. He walked to the entrance without haste, but also without hesitation, each step echoing lightly on the church floor until he reached the stone landing where Anna stood. Upon arriving beside Mrs. Eudora, Joe took his straw hat from his hands, pressed it against his chest for an instant, as if it were a small shield, and looked first at Anna, then at the pious woman, and finally at the people gathered around. With a firm but calm voice, he said that this woman was a child of God like any other, that the church door had no lock for the poor, nor padlock for widows, and that no one had the authority to leave a sick child outside with a fever, while candles burned inside, asking for protection for those who were already safe and sound. He recounted that he had seen many disasters in life, floods washing away homes, people losing everything, and that the only thing that saved them sometimes was an open door and an extended hand. The way he spoke wasn't that of someone wanting to humiliate back, but of someone inviting others to look at the scene from another angle. This stirred some hearts there. Mrs. Eudora, however, still tried to argue, saying she wasn't forbidding anyone to pray, that she was just looking out for the environment, that certain people brought trouble, and that he didn't know the history. Joe listened without interrupting, took a deep breath, and replied that he knew history well, because he carried his own on his shoulders and in his pocket, and that if God started measuring who could enter by the amount of sin or bad reputation, perhaps the church would stay empty. Then he turned again to Anna, extended a hand to Michael, and asked the name of the sick child, as if, by knowing the name, he was already making a commitment. Michael, shyly, said her name was Rose. The carpenter smiled slightly at the unconscious girl, as if he had stored that name in an important place, and then spoke aloud that Rose would not stay outside in that heat. He put his arm under Anna's shoulders, gently, without invading, just offering support, and took a step forward as if clearing a path. His presence, firm and serene, caused the small circle of people to step back a little, opening a way almost without realizing it. Mrs. Eudora hesitated for a second, looked at his face, recognizing he was the man who had been fixing the pews of that very church for weeks, and felt torn between her rigidity and the embarrassment of saying such a hard no in front of everyone. She ended up retreating half a step, enough for Anna to cross the threshold. The cool air of the church interior enveloped Rose's hot body and Anna's sweaty face like an unexpected embrace. The smell of burning beeswax, dried flowers in clay vases, and old wood contrasted with the odor of sweat and dust coming from the road. Michael looked at everything with wide eyes, as if entering another world. Joe guided the three to a pew further back, where the sun didn't hit directly, and asked Anna to sit for a moment to catch her breath. Then he went to a small stone font, where water was kept for the priest's hands, filled a clay mug, and brought it for her to wet her daughter's parched lips and wipe a damp cloth on the girl's forehead. As she tended to Rose with careful gestures, feeling the cold water steal the fire from the girl's skin for a few seconds, a murmur ran through the pews. People who had been inside from the start were now whispering, some disapproving of Joe's boldness, others respecting in silence what they saw, without the courage to praise, but also without the courage to condemn. The priest, a thin, middle-aged man, heard the rumors from the small vestry where he was preparing for the next prayer, wiped his hands on a cloth, and came out into the nave, curious and concerned. Seeing Anna with the child in her lap and Joe beside them, he approached, asked kindly what was happening, and heard from the carpenter a simple summary. A mother needing help. A door that was almost closed. A church that was learning right there, in that instant, to be a shelter again. Anna, teary-eyed, quickly told of the walk, Rose's fever, the eviction from the ranch, and the fear she felt of having no place left in this world where she could enter without being shooed away. The priest, with a serious expression, listened to the end, cast a quick glance toward the door where Mrs. Eudora pretended to arrange a vase while listening to everything, and then placed his hand on the girl's head and murmured a simple prayer, asking not only for Rose's health, but also that this church never again forget that its first function was to be a home for those who had no home at all. After the words of blessing echoed, Joe leaned in close to Anna and spoke in a low voice, so only she and Michael could hear. He said that nearby, past the cemetery and behind the church, there was a patch of half-forgotten ground, where the ruins of an old stone chapel and an old shack nobody wanted stood. He told her almost no one went near there because they said it was a cursed place, that people had died of hunger at the doors of those stones, that at night one could hear the weeping of lost souls. But he added, with a different shine in his eyes, that more than fear, what he saw there was a corner of the world without an owner, a space that could be a fresh start for someone who had already lost too much. Anna looked at him with astonishment and a remnant of suspicion. She asked, her voice tired, if he really thought it was possible to live in a place like that, if there wouldn't be trouble with anyone, if he wouldn't be getting into more of a fight than he already had. Joe explained that formally, that land lay in a somewhat forgotten zone, between the rectory's backyard and the start of a rocky slope. Nobody was interested in it because crops wouldn't grow, there was no water nearby, and it still carried the bad reputation of old times. He also said that if she accepted, he could help cover the holes in the shack, fix the door, arrange a makeshift bed with planks so that, at least for that night, she and the children would have a roof. He reinforced that he promised no comfort nor abundance, but promised not to leave her outside again. The proposal sounded like something too big for someone who had been receiving only refusals. Anna hesitated, thinking she didn't know this man, barely knew his name, that the world could be cruel even when it seemed kind. But something in the way he had defended her at the church door How he had faced the stares and harsh words without raising his voice gave her a strange sense of safety. The fact that he had stood up from the back pew, where no one expects movement, also had a symbolic weight she couldn't yet name, but felt in her chest like a gentle push toward trust. Accepting that invitation meant entering a territory of legend and fear, but it also meant having, for the first time in a long while, a piece of the world that, even if improvised, could be called home. After looking at Michael, who watched her as if expecting a sentence about their future, and adjusting Rose more comfortably in her lap, Anna took a deep breath and told Joe she accepted. She asked only that he have patience with her fears and those of her children, who might get scared at any noise in the night, any longer shadow, any story the wind seemed to bring from the past. When they left the church, the sun was already starting to lower a bit, leaving the light less harsh but still hot. The people in the square moved aside to open a path, some with looks of disapproval, others with silent curiosity, like those watching the first scene of a story they don't yet know the ending to. Mrs. Eudora remained near the door, fingering a rosary harder than necessary, while following the three with her eyes, mentally marking every step they took as if saving ammunition for future comments. Joe walked beside Anna and the children, skirting the church, passing behind the small cemetery where wooden crosses, some crooked and nameless, marked lives that had faded away in days of sun and rain. The smell of dry earth, mixed with withered flowers and melted wax, created a dense atmosphere. As they approached the back, the scenery changed. The terrain dipped a little, forming a sort of rocky hollow where clumps of hardy brush insisted on living despite the dryness. Remnants of a stone wall, covered in moss and stained by time, outlined what had once been a small chapel. An adobe shack, attached to one of these walls, displayed holes in the tiled roof and gaps in the joints of the wooden beams that formed its frame. Anna felt a chill seeing the place. It wasn't just the abandoned look, but the feeling that something there held heavy stories. She asked carefully what had happened on that patch of ground for everyone to avoid it so. Joe took a deep breath and recounted that many years ago, in a drought even worse than this one, a group of migrants had come seeking help at that old chapel, where a priest did a kind of charity work with donations coming from afar. He said the official story was that, since help didn't arrive in time, some died right there, leaning against the stones, and that since then, it was said the place wept at night. He added, however, that this was what was told on the surface, and that he always had the impression that pieces were missing from that narrative, as if someone had an interest in leaving everything half foggy. As he spoke, Michael examined the interior of the shack with his eyes through the half-open door. Inside, one could see a dirt floor, some spiderwebs in the corners, the remains of a clay stove buried in dust, and a broken bench leaning against one wall. Light entered in oblique beams through holes in the roof, kicking up dust particles that danced in the air. It was little, but it was more than the road. Anna entered slowly, smelling mold and abandonment, mixed with the strong odor of dry earth. She placed Rose carefully in a corner where the ground seemed less hard, using the cloth she carried on her back as a makeshift mattress. Michael approached her, leaning against the clay wall as if he wanted to merge with it. Joe stayed in the doorway for a while, observing the scene, mentally calculating what would be needed to make that space minimally habitable. He thought of the planks he could get at the store in exchange for work, the tiles left over from a recent job at the rectory, the nails he kept in a small wooden box. He told Anna that that night he would stay nearby, finishing a job he had at the priest's house, and that he could bring a little more water and perhaps some simple food. She thanked him with a thread of a voice and felt the weight of gratitude mixed with a new fear, that of owing something to someone who had helped her when no one else wanted to. As the sun said goodbye behind the rocks, tinting the ruins and cracked walls of the shack gold, a warm breeze began to blow, bringing distant sounds from the square and inside the church. The bell struck a few times, announcing the end of the afternoon, and the echo arrived faintly to that forgotten corner. Anna adjusted the children, ran her hand through Rose's hair, now a little less hot thanks to the cool water and shade, and allowed herself, for the first time in a long while, to close her eyes for a few seconds without being in motion. It was in this heavy silence, broken only by the buzzing of insects and the soft creak of old wood in the roof, that she heard a different sound. A small crack coming from a corner of the stone wall that formed the back of the shack. At first, she thought it was just the natural movement of some beam dried out by the drought, but the noise repeated, as if something inside gave way millimeters, pushed by some discrete force. Michael also noticed, lifted his head, and asked his mother if she had heard. Anna replied yes, and, despite the fatigue, felt a pang of curiosity pierce the veil of exhaustion. She got up slowly, careful not to wake Rose, and approached the piece of stone wall where the sound seemed to come from. The light entering through a crack in the roof illuminated just that point, revealing a small vertical fissure between two stones, darker than the rest. When she ran her fingertips over the crack, she felt a current of cold air coming out, a rare thing in such a dry and hot place. That made her shiver. For an instant, she thought of stories of lost souls, of laments trapped deep in the walls, and stepped back. But the same force that had made her face the humiliation at the church door now pushed her not to retreat before a simple hole in the stone. Michael, curious, brought a small stick he had found on the ground and offered it to his mother. She took the piece of wood and delicately began to poke at the crack, clearing away some of the accumulated dust. The small fissure widened slightly, revealing a greater darkness inside. A second crack, sharper, sounded, and one of the smaller stones, serving as a wedge between two larger ones, shifted a little, as if just waiting for that minimal push to give way. Anna felt her heart speed up, no longer from immediate fear, but from a strange sensation of meddling with something no one had touched for many years. She slid her fingertips into the crack, feeling the roughness of the stone and the dry dust crumbling in her fingers, and with measured effort pulled the small stone out. When she managed to remove it completely, a small hole the size of an adult hand appeared at the base of the wall, opening a passage to a hollow space behind that masonry. Colder air came from inside, carrying a different smell, something between old mold and stored metal. Michael held his breath, eyes shining with expectation. Anna, still kneeling, reached her hand into that void, fingers groping in the dark, until touching something soft but firm, like aged fabric wrapped around something. When she pulled slowly, she felt it was a small bundle. A coarse cloth sack, hardened by time, came haltingly out of the hole, dragging a little loose dirt. She held the bundle in her hands, weighing it, noting there was something solid inside, producing a faint, muffled clink when moved. For an instant, all the fatigue, all the pain, and all the humiliation of the last months hung suspended in the air, replaced by a tense silence, full of questions. In that forgotten shack behind the church, on the land nobody wanted, in the walls of an old chapel where they said there was only death and curses, Anna had just pulled with her own calloused hands the first visible thread of a secret that the town of St. Benedict's Crossing had buried long ago, and that was now beginning to stir again, ready to change the destiny of everyone. If you're enjoying this story, leave a like and share it with someone who needs to believe that hands still reach out for us when everyone else turns away. Because what this woman is about to discover in that forgotten place behind the church will show that even the driest frontier can hide a justice no one imagined. The days following the discovery of that small cloth sack were marked by a mix of timid hope and silent fear in Anna Claire's chest. That first night, she didn't have the courage to open the bundle entirely. She limited herself to squeezing it between her hands, feeling the irregular weight and hearing the faint muffled clink coming from inside, while the dark of the shack seemed to breathe along with her. Michael, lying beside his sister, asked in whispers what his mother thought it was, if it could be food, if it could be a toy lost by some child from the old days, if it could be something that would finally make things better. Anna replied only that she didn't know yet, that sometimes God hid answers inside small scraps of cloth, but one needed to be calm to open them. When the sun began to rise the next day, tinting the edges of the rocks around the shack pink and orange, Anna gathered her courage. She sat on the dirt floor, back resting against the adobe wall and the children nearby, and began to undo the hardened knot of the sack. Her fingers, accustomed to the effort of washing clothes, worked with patience until the fabric gave way, liberating a handful of old coins, darkened by time. With designs almost worn away, but still recognizable as valuable metal. Mixed with them was a small paper folded many times, so thin from being handled in the past that it seemed ready to disintegrate at a simple touch. Michael's eyes went wide, seeing the discreet shine of the coins, as if he were looking at a treasure from a dime novel. Rose, still weak, crawled closer and touched one of the coins with her fingertips, feeling the cold of the metal contrast with the heat of her feverish skin. Anna separated the coins carefully, counting them one by one, though she didn't know exactly how much that could mean in dollars, as she wasn't in the habit of handling large sums. What intrigued her most, however, was the paper. With slightly trembling hands, she unfolded it with extreme attention. The letters, in somewhat faded ink, occupied almost the entire surface, written in beautiful but antiquated penmanship. The first words she could distinguish spoke of donations, family names from the town of St. Benedict's Crossing, promises of aid to migrants and widows, and cited a relief fund kept in the House of God for God's poor. The problem was that Anna couldn't read everything fluently. She could identify some words, having learned as a girl from a patient relative, but that text contained expressions that were beyond her reach. She folded the paper again, kept it with the coins inside the sack, and made a difficult decision. She would need help from someone who knew how to read properly, someone she could trust enough not to turn that secret into one more weapon against her. The image that immediately came to mind was the young sexton she had seen briefly in the church. A skinny boy with a still adolescent face who always walked with a small prayer book in his hands and seemed more scared of Mrs. Eudora's scolding than curious about town gossip. It was risky, but she saw no other way out. Keeping that paper to herself without understanding it would be like holding a key without knowing which door it could open. Later that same day, when the sun was already climbing with force, Joe Wright appeared at the shack door, carrying a cloth bundle where, by the outline, one could see a piece of coarse bread and perhaps some leftover cheese. His face showed a serene concern, the kind that doesn't manifest in alarm, but in constant gestures. He asked how they had passed the night, if Rose's fever had gone down a bit, if the roof, even full of holes, had held against the cold wind that blew stronger in the early hours. Anna recounted, in a low voice, the slight improvements in the girl, Michael's strange dreams of hearing weeping coming from the walls, and with hesitation showed the cloth sack and coins she had found. Joe's eyes narrowed for an instant, not out of greed, but from the immediate awareness that this wasn't something small. He took one of the coins between his thick fingers, observed the mark, weighed it in his hand like someone weighing not just metal, but history. He commented that this wasn't simple change dropped in a corner, but something kept there on purpose. When Anna showed the paper and confessed she didn't understand everything written, he suggested that perhaps the sexton could help, provided he was approached with care and discretion. He said that sometimes those who live in the shadow of the powerful learn to keep secrets better than anyone else, simply because they have no one to tell without running risks. They agreed then that Anna would go to the church in the late afternoon, when movement was slower, and speak quietly with the boy, asking him to read the paper without mentioning it to anyone. Joe offered to accompany her, not to pressure, but to be there in case any crossword was thrown at her. While settling these details, Anna observed the way he expressed himself, always measuring words, avoiding phrases that could inflame gossip further, but never suggesting she keep it just to herself, as if it were a temptation without an owner. This planted in her heart the seed of an even greater dilemma. How far would it be fair to appropriate that treasure hidden in a place that, even forgotten, still belonged to the memory of many people? In the late afternoon, the sky gained golden tones when Anna climbed the small church stairs again, this time without the urgent fever of her daughter in her arms, but with a different fear throbbing in her chest. Michael accompanied her, carrying a small satchel where the paper was kept, wrapped in another piece of cloth. Rose stayed in the shack, under the watchful eye of Joe Wright, who promised not to move from there while mother and son went to the church. Upon entering the temple, Anna felt the same coolness as before, but now mixed with the memory of the humiliation suffered there. She saw the young sexton arranging candles near the altar and approached slowly, calling him by the name she had heard someone pronounce, Elijah. Elijah raised his face, surprised to hear his name in such a soft tone. He recognized Anna and reflexively cast a quick glance toward the door, as if fearing to see Mrs. Eudora appear at any moment to ask what he was doing, talking to that woman. When he realized no one was watching them, he relaxed his shoulders a little. Anna explained in a few sentences, and with many pauses, that she had found an old paper in a cavity of the shack behind the church, and that she needed badly to understand what was written there. She asked him not to mention it to anyone, especially those who lived keeping an eye on every move of other people's lives. Elijah, after hesitating, accepted. There was in his eyes an honest curiosity, mixed with the desire to do something right in a place where often he felt he only repeated empty gestures. They sat in one of the pews further back, near a column where the light was weak, and Michael handed over the satchel. Elijah opened the cloth, unfolded the old paper on his own knee, and began to read in a low voice, almost whispering, so only Anna and the boy could hear. The first lines spoke of a record of donations made to the St. Michael's Charity Fund, instituted by Father Stephen many years ago, with the objective of helping migrants and families in extreme misery during droughts. Names of families from the town were repeated, accompanied by amounts in coins and small valuable objects like rings, earrings, and brooches. There was also an indication that part of those resources should be used to buy medicine, supplies, and, when possible, to lease small portions of land to poor cultivators. Anna felt her heart tighten when she heard among the names of the donors that of Silas Thorne. The colonel, who now made a point of kicking her out and staining her name, had, in the past, contributed coins and promises of land to that fund. At the same time, the paper made clear that the resources should remain kept in a safe place, in the house of prayer, until distributed under the supervision of the priest and 2 guardians chosen by the community. Elijah continued reading and found further down a note in a different hand, perhaps from years later. In it, Father Stephen mentioned the arrival of extra donations during a great drought and his concern with the fact that some benefactors wished to influence who would or wouldn't be helped, trying to use the fund as an instrument of power, not charity. This part of the reading made Anna understand that what she held in her hands wasn't just a handful of forgotten coins, but the trail of an interrupted project, an ancient attempt to do justice that had been swallowed by the silence of time and, probably, by greater interests. Elijah, voice trembling, confessed he had never heard of this fund so clearly. He said that now and then He heard vague comments about a priest who had vanished, about donations that came from afar, but that no one liked to go into detail. It made him restless, as if witnessing something that had always been there, but everyone pretended not to see. When he finished reading, the boy folded the paper with the same delicacy with which he had opened it and returned it to Anna, reinforcing that it needed to be kept carefully, far from the eyes of those startled by anything threatening the apparent peace of the town. He commented that if that record came to light properly, it could change a lot of things. However, he also warned that powerful people don't like having old secrets dug up, especially if those secrets involve unfulfilled promises to the poor and migrants. His words weighed in the air. Anna realized that the dilemma opening before her was greater than the temptation to use those coins just to save her own home. That same day, upon returning to the shack, she found Rose with the fever a little more controlled, thanks to Joe's simple care and the cool shade he had managed by reinforcing part of the roof with borrowed tiles. As soon as the children fell asleep, Anna told the carpenter everything Elijah had read, repeating with maximum fidelity every detail she could remember. She spoke of the charity fund, the family names, the promises of land, the mention of the colonel as a donor, the priest's concerns about potential embezzlement. As she related this, Joe paced from one side to the other inside the shack, hand on chin, slow steps marking the weight of each piece of information. He commented that if all that was true, then that money and anything else kept in the walls of that old chapel didn't belong to a single man, nor a single family, but to a whole forgotten people. At the same time, he recognized that the coins right there in front of them could mean the difference between life and death, at least in the short term, for those children. The tension between immediate necessity and collective justice installed itself like a knot in Anna's chest. She spent the night awake, looking alternately at the sleeping faces of her children and the cloth sack leaning against the wall, asking herself what the right path was. The dilemma gained even more painful contours when, a few days later, Michael began to show signs of illness. The boy, who until then was the most resilient, started complaining of body aches, fever, and a dry cough that left him breathless. Anna ran again to the village general store, asking the apothecary for some basic medicine, even a simple syrup or recommended herbs. The man, with a heavy air, explained he couldn't sell on credit to someone who had been put out of the colonel's ranch and who already carried a reputation for bringing bad luck. He said that if Silas Thorne knew he had helped, he'd cut his credit too, and that in dry times no one could afford the luxury of risking what they had out of too much pity. Desperate, Anna returned to the shack and stared for the first time with anger at the cloth sack. That was no longer just a symbol of promise or a record of injustice. It was, in that instant, the only concrete chance to get medicine for her son. With trembling hands, she decided to separate one of the coins, the one that looked most worn, hoping it would cause less lack in the total sum. She wrapped it in a piece of simple cloth and went back to the store, trying to disguise her nervousness. When she placed the coin on the counter, the discreet shine of the metal caught the apothecary's attention immediately. He took the piece, evaluated the weight and design, and asked, eyebrows raised, where she had gotten that. Anna replied evasively that it was something left by her husband, an old keepsake, and that now she needed to exchange it for medicine. The man remained suspicious, but the strength of the coin's value spoke louder. He ended up giving in, handing Anna a bottle of medicine and some dried herbs, saying that would have to be enough for a good while, because he wouldn't do that kind of business with her again. His tone made clear he would tell someone sooner or later about that strange transaction. Even so, Anna ran back, heart divided between relief and guilt. When she gave the first sip of medicine to Michael and saw the cough calm down little by little, she felt an almost physical hope, as if the air became less heavy inside the shack. But the victory came, accompanied by the certainty that she had crossed a line. She had used part of something that on paper didn't belong only to her. It didn't take long for signs of this transgression to start reverberating through the town. The apothecary, unable to keep a secret for long, commented to an acquaintance about the old coin he had received from the ranch widow, and the story spread like fire in dry straw. Some thought it was exaggeration. Others began to embroider details, saying she had stolen something from the big house before leaving, that she had seized old church jewelry, that she had meddled where she shouldn't near the cemetery and the old chapel. Anna's name returned to conversations with renewed airs of suspicion. These rumors inevitably reached the ears of Silas Thorne. The colonel, sitting in the shade of the big house porch, received from one of his most loyal henchmen the news that his ex-daughter-in-law, now installed in the shack behind the church, was buying medicine with old coins of considerable value. The henchman insinuated that perhaps she had found something the colonel's family had left stored in remote times, or even something belonging to the church, commenting that the old chapel always carried a reputation for hiding valuables kept by priests. Silas Thorne's reaction was a mixture of irritation and curiosity. He didn't like the idea that Anna might be rising without needing the scraps he controlled, and liked even less the possibility that there was wealth hidden on lands he considered, by right, part of his moral dominion, if not official. From that moment on, the antagonist entered more directly into Anna and Joe's lives. First, with almost invisible but devastating gestures. A message arrived at the apothecary warning that credit for certain people would be seen as disrespect to the colonel. The nearest well, which many used without thinking of owners, was surrounded by armed men who began to watch who approached, making clear with cold stares that some were no longer welcome there. A small farmer who used to give a little flour in exchange for Michael's chores warned he could no longer do so, for he had a family and couldn't risk being looked upon unfavorably. Anna began to feel the siege tightening again, but now with a crucial difference. She wasn't completely alone. Joe Wright, aware of the change in winds, became even more present. He started bringing water from a more distant spring, doing small repairs for townspeople who hadn't yet been completely captured by fear, and sharing the little he managed with Anna and the children. On one of these comings and goings, on an afternoon when the sun gave a truce and the wind blew fine dust, 2 men in the colonel's service intercepted him on the dirt road. With fake smiles and heavy hands placed on his shoulder, they asked if it was true he was mixed up with people meddling in buried things, if he wasn't afraid of being confused with a church thief. He replied calmly that he didn't meddle in anyone's secrets, that he only helped those in need, and made clear he wouldn't be easily intimidated. Even so, the message had been sent. The threat was now drawn more sharply. In conversations at the table of the big house, Silas Thorne went so far as to suggest, amidst sips of strong coffee and puffs on his pipe, that perhaps it was time to put order in that part of the village, reminding everyone who ruled there. Some men nodded in silence, others looked away, uncomfortable. The priest, who depended on the colonel's donations to keep the church standing, felt torn, knowing there was something wrong with the way that widow was being treated, but fearing to displease the man who, ultimately, paid for the roof repairs and the more expensive candles. Meanwhile, in the shack, the relationship between Anna and Joe deepened in confidences. On nights when the heat allowed sitting a bit outside, under the star-filled sky, they talked about the past. He told, in details, he had never shared with anyone there until then, about the flood that had taken his wife and daughter in a distant settlement, a rain that fell too hard all at once, making the river rise like a furious beast and dragging away houses, bridges, and dreams in a matter of minutes. He spoke of the guilt he felt for not managing to get them out in time, for underestimating the force of the water, for thinking they could wait a little longer. Since then, he said, he carried a debt to anyone he saw on the brink of disaster, especially single mothers with children clinging to their skirts. Anna listened to that story in silence, realizing that his gesture at the church door hadn't been just a momentary impulse, but the fruit of an old wound that made him stand up when others preferred to stay seated. In exchange, she spoke about the weight of the words she had heard from the colonel's mouth, about the cold look with which he expelled her from the ranch, about the feeling of carrying on her back, the guilt for Jacob's accident, even knowing deep down that the rain and mud bore more responsibility than any mortal carelessness. These dialogues, interspersed with silences full of meaning, were building a bridge of trust between the two. Amidst this growing closeness, Joe suggested they go back to investigating the walls of the old chapel, not out of greed, but to better understand what was buried there, and perhaps find more clues about what Father Stephen had planned before disappearing. One late afternoon, with Michael curious and Rose steadier, though still fragile, they gathered inside the shack and began a sort of careful excavation. Using improvised tools like an old hoe and pieces of iron found in the neighborhood, they started tapping lightly on different points of the stone wall, attentive to the sound. In some places the noise was solid, betraying dense stone. In others, there was a hollow echo, indicating cavities. After a few days of intermittent work, always hiding the marks carefully so no one would notice from outside, they located a larger part of the wall that sounded empty. Under Joe's instinctive guidance, knowing well how old structures were reinforced, they began to remove one by one smaller stones that seemed to be there just to fill a space, not to support anything. Behind them, a wider opening appeared than the first, from which came a puff of even colder and denser air, bringing an intense smell of mold, old paper, and oxidized metal. With the weak light of a makeshift lamp, they managed to see the interior of a kind of deep niche where small wooden boxes, already half-eaten by time, were lined up alongside other cloth sacks, like the first one. Inside the boxes, they found more coins, varying in size and wear, and also small silver objects like a crucifix, a ring with a faded stone, and a brooch with a figure of a saint. But what caught Anna and Joe's attention most weren't the metals, but a thick covered notebook of dried leather, fastened by a strap that still held more or less intact. Opening it carefully, they discovered pages and pages of records written by the same hand that appeared on the first paper, Father Stephen noting with precision every donation received, every withdrawal made to buy food, medicine, and even seeds. On many pages there were also personal observations, almost like brief diaries, where he mentioned arguments with important men who wanted to limit who the fund could help. In some passages, read with Elijah's help in discreet reading sessions, it said the priest was increasingly disappointed with the hypocrisy of certain benefactors who showed themselves generous in public but in private. Pressured so the fund wouldn't help certain groups of migrants coming from lands that had once risen against the power of the colonels. There was an indirect mention of Silas Thorne as one of these men, described as someone who wanted his name constantly remembered in sermons, but wouldn't accept seeing those he considered ancient enemies receive the same bread he helped buy. The notebook made clear, too, that the priest planned to formalize, in a proper deed, that this whole set of assets would be, forever, destined for the benefit of the poorest of the frontier, regardless of ties to specific families. Reading these things in a low voice, in the shadows of the church or the dark nook of the shack, lit in Anna a new feeling of indignation mixed with responsibility. She began to realize that her individual story of humiliation and eviction was connected to a much longer thread of injustices, of silenced people, of resources hoarded and never fully distributed. At the same time, every page reinforced the weight of the moral dilemma. If all that were divulged at once, it could unleash a storm in the town, perhaps even a violent one. If kept hidden, it would continue to reproduce the cycle of silence and inequality. And amidst all this, her children continued needing to eat, clothe, take medicine. The first concrete consequence of using the coin to buy medicine didn't take long to manifest directly against her. On a market day, when Anna went to the square with a small handful of dried beans to trade for flour, some looks harder than usual followed her. She heard fragments of phrases, folks commenting she was doing too well for someone with nothing, asking what miracle was that to make a sick child get better so fast without a dime, saying that couldn't come from a clean source. Mrs. Eudora, crossing paths with her near a peddler's stall, stopped, looked her up and down with an air of fake pity, and commented, in a tone loud enough for many to hear, that sometimes God let certain people find things to see what they would do, if they would share the bread or eat it in secret, and that no one should be fooled thinking heaven didn't see what was done in the shadows. These words reached, by tortuous paths, the ears of Elijah, who started getting even more distressed, knowing he was part of the circle of people who knew the secret. He went to the shack on a night of strong moonlight, and voice trembling, asked Anna and Joe what they intended to do with all that. He said that if the colonel knew of the existence of the notebook and boxes, he wouldn't hesitate to order wall torn from wall until recovering what he considered his. He also said that, on the other hand, there were people in the town who could be awakened to a new way of seeing things if they knew their parents or grandparents had contributed to a greater project of solidarity buried there. It was in this conversation that the idea emerged for the first time to transform that secret into something that could benefit the entire town, but gradually, so as not to provoke an immediate explosion of violence. Joe, with the practical way of someone who had assembled and disassembled many structures in life, proposed they start helping discreetly some families in desperate situations, using small portions of the coins and recording in a new notebook how that was being used. He said that in parallel they could think of a way to present part of the truth to the priest, involving him as an ally, so he too would feel responsible and less bound by fear of the colonel. Anna, listening to all this, felt her heart oscillate between fear and a kind of internal flame that lit up every time she imagined a line of women, children, and elderly knocking on the door of that old chapel, no longer as a scene of abandonment, but of welcome. However, the simple possibility of openly facing Silas Thorne terrified her. For now, she agreed with the plan to use the coins in a limited and careful way, always prioritizing extreme cases. A lady living alone in a tumble-down hovel, a sick man who could no longer swing a hoe, a family of migrants recently arrived with children dehydrated by the journey. As this small flow of help began to spread, even if anonymously, the town felt something change in the air. Suddenly, a sack of flour appeared at the door of someone who had none, a package of medicine in the window of someone coughing for weeks, a piece of clothing for a child who previously spent the cold dawn shivering. No one could say exactly where it all came from, though some suspected. And as always happens, where there is change and silent grace, the fear of those who hold power also rises. Silas Thorne, realizing his control over those living in misery was beginning to loosen, became even more attentive to movements at the back of the church, suspecting that there, in the shadow of the old stones, something was growing far from his hands. It was on one of those nights when Anna and Joe were returning from discreetly taking a sack of food to the house of an old widow on the other side of the creek, and encountered, on the path, one of the colonel's henchmen stopped in the middle of the road. The man, mounted on a lean horse, looked at the two with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and asked a simple question, but loaded with threat. Wanted to know what they were doing so late, why they carried a sack that was now empty where they had gone. Joe replied naturally that they had helped a sick neighbor without going into details. The henchman pretended to find the answer lovely, praised their charity, and completed by saying the boss was interested in knowing who was acting more generous than him in that region. From that moment it became clear to Anna that the secret she guarded in the walls of the old chapel was about to stop being just an intimate dilemma and transform into fuel for a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. The charity fund buried under stone and dust had woken up, and he who had always lived by controlling other people's misery wouldn't stand with crossed arms watching this new flow of kindness escape through a crack that didn't pass through the big house. And it was precisely in the middle of this squeeze, with danger approaching by the dirt roads and square whispers, that Anna began to understand that, behind every coin and every note in the old notebook, there was a direct question aimed at her. What to do with a secret that can save your family, but also liberate or set fire to an entire community. The night everything seemed to collapse began with a different wind blowing through the stones of the old cemetery of St. Benedict's Crossing. It was early September 1891, and the sky, despite being clear, brought an unrest the people of the frontier knew well, that feeling that the air is so still inside that any spark can light a fire. In the shack leaning against the ruins of the old chapel, Anna was settling the children to sleep when she heard in the distance the dry crack of harness and the trample of horses approaching. Her heart tightened even before any shape emerged from the shadow, as if the body knew before the eyes that the short peace they had lived was coming to an end. Michael, already used to reading fear in his mother's face, sat up suddenly on the mat, alert, while Rose, weaker, just curled up even more under the thin cloth covering her. The first flashes of lanterns appeared soon ahead, silhouetting men mounted on horseback, descending by the side of the church and skirting the cemetery toward the hollow. The dust the hooves kicked up formed a pale cloud around them, mixed with the smoke coming from the mouths of those smoking to disguise nervousness. At the front, unmistakable in his upright posture and wide-brimmed hat, came Colonel Silas Thorne. The colonel didn't usually dirty his leather boots on night raids, but that night he made a point of coming himself. Curiosity and a wounded sense of ownership had conquered comfort. The news that his ex-daughter-in-law was distributing food and medicine through the town with old coins lit in him an ancient flame of rage, the sensation of losing control over the misery of others. Joe Wright, who was finishing reinforcing the makeshift lock on the shack door, noticed the movement first. Hearing the horses, he stepped a few paces outside, trying to see where they came from. When he saw the group skirting the church and descending toward them, he took a deep breath and went back inside, face serious. He told Anna, in few words, that the colonel was coming, and not for a courtesy visit. Her gaze ran instinctively to the wall, where behind a strip of carefully replaced stones, the wooden boxes and the priest's old notebook were hidden. The simple thought of seeing those proofs in the wrong hands sent a chill down her spine, despite the muggy heat of that night. There was no time to hide anything else. In a few minutes the horses were practically at the shack door. One of the henchmen dismounted first with a shove, banging hard on the fragile wood, making it shake as if the whole thing would fall. Silas Thorne's voice came right after, thick and dry, echoing in the silence of the hollow, wanted them to open the door, not to force him to enter, that he knew very well things had come out of there that didn't belong to that family. Michael jumped in front of his mother as if he could protect her with his own body, too small before armed men, but big enough to feel he didn't want to see her fall again. Joe put his hand on the boy's shoulder and placed him behind himself, picking up a sturdy piece of wood he used as a prop for repairs and holding it like an oar in a raging river. When Anna opened the door, she felt a wave of hot dust and horse smell invade the shack. Outside, the silhouette of the colonel cut against the glare of the lanterns seemed bigger than he really was. Silas Thorne's gaze slid over that poor interior, lingering on the children's faces, on the thin body of his ex-daughter-in-law, on the firm way the carpenter placed himself between them and the night. He entered a step, the floor creaking under his boots. Without beating around the bush, he asked where the coins were, said he already knew about the medicine purchase, about the sack of food left at a widow's door, about the rumors of nocturnal charity. He went further, affirmed that that land, that old chapel and everything inside it belonged to his moral heritage, because without his family's lands, no church would have been erected there. Anna heard those words as if they were stones thrown against her chest. For a moment, the old urge to shrink, to apologize for existing, threatened to take over. But the sight of Michael's sweaty face and Rose's breathing still half-labored, now stronger thanks to the medicine bought with a single coin, gave her back the courage she had shown at the church door weeks before. She replied she hadn't stolen anything from anyone, that what she found in the stones wasn't the private treasure of any colonel, but the trail of promises made to the poor people of St. Benedict's Crossing. She spoke that she had seen, with her own eyes, Silas Thorne's name written among the donors, and that if he wanted to claim anything there, the first right would belong to the destitute for whom the donations were destined and never arrived. Her words made the air heavier. One of the henchmen took a step forward, hand approaching the grip of a revolver, as if that tone of boldness was intolerable. Joe, perceiving the movement, raised the piece of wood a little more, without making a direct threat, but making clear he wouldn't let anyone lay a finger on Anna or the children without, at least, facing some resistance. The colonel, seeing the tension grow, raised his hand, ordering his men to stop for an instant. He didn't want blood there, near the church, on that ground even more sacred by legend than by official records. What he wanted above all was to recover what he judged to be his, and perhaps crush, once and for all, that woman's courage. With a colder tone, Silas Thorne announced that if things weren't handed over right there, that night, he would proceed to tear down stone by stone of that shack and ruins until finding what he sought. Said no one in that town would have the courage to defend her, that everyone owed more to him than to their own conscience, and that when the day dawned, if necessary, he himself would set fire to that forgotten corner. The image of flames licking the adobe walls, with Michael and Rose coughing in the smoke, crossed Anna's mind like a bolt of lightning. At the same time, something in her chest revolted at the idea of retreating again. Before any answer came, however, a different sound cut the night. It was the church bell, ringing insistently, much faster than any habitual call for prayers. The metallic sound echoed through the town, descending the hill, crossing the square, arriving at the hollow like a racing heartbeat. The priest, alerted by Elijah that the colonel had left home with armed men toward Anna's shack, decided to use the only power remaining to him, to summon the people to witness what was happening. Every toll was an announcement that something grave demanded open eyes and ears, not whispers behind backs. Silas Thorne's men looked at each other, uncomfortable. Some of them were, after all, sons of that same people, used to hearing the bell call for baptisms, weddings and funerals. The colonel frowned, irritated by the priest's interference, but knew he couldn't simply ignore such an explicit call without losing part of his aura as a man respectful of faith. Grumbling, he said the conversation wasn't over, that he wanted to see that woman and the carpenter in front of the church with what they had found before the bell stopped ringing. Turned his back, mounted the horse again, and pulled the reins with a brusque gesture, signal for the others to follow him back to the square. Anna stood still for a few seconds, feeling the heavy silence left after their departure. The bell continued to toll, now more spaced out, as if calling her name without using words. Michael looked at his mother, waiting for a decision, eyes wide between fear and hope. Joe took a deep breath and suggested that this might be the opportunity to take the matter out of the shack's shadows and bring it into the light, where more people could hear and see. said that if they kept fighting alone they would be crushed, but if they put the truth in the middle of the square, before the cross and the eyes of those who had always kept quiet out of fear, maybe the story would take another path. The final dilemma took shape in that instant. Anna could, on one hand over part of what she had found in secret to the colonel, in an attempt to calm his fury and protect the children, even if that meant erasing again the promises made to the poor of old times. On the other, she could take the notebook, the paper, and perhaps some coins in front of everyone, risking not only her own life, but also the precarious tranquility of the town. The image of women and children receiving food in secret, of widows lighting a candle of thanks for baskets left anonymously at their doors, came to mind like a fast film. And with it, the memory of the humiliation at the church door on that hot August afternoon, when she was almost forbidden to enter with her sick daughter. With a voice still trembling, but decided, Anna said she would go to the square. She asked Joe to carry the notebook and the first paper found, the one bearing the colonel's name and the donor families. She hid the cloth sack with most of the coins in an even deeper hiding place behind another strip of stones, thinking that if things went out of control, someone needed to survive to continue what Father Stephen had started. Took Michael by the hand, adjusted Rose in her arms, now lighter, and climbed, together with the carpenter, up the slope leading to the front of the church. Every step seemed to weigh more than the last, but also brought with it the sensation of walking not just for herself, but dragging centuries of silence behind. The square in front of St. Benedict's Church was no longer the almost empty yard she had seen the first time. People came from all sides, awakened by the bell. Women with aprons still dirty with flour, men who had abandoned hoes and tools, curious children, old folks leaning on thin canes, all gathering little by little before the church stairs. The makeshift lanterns created circles of yellowish light on the dirt ground, and people's shadows elongated, mixing as if they were a single mass of expectation. The priest was at the top of the steps, dark cassock contrasting with the white wall, with the bell now stopped above his head. Beside him, expression tense, was Elijah, the young sexton, firmly holding a small crucifix, as if that could give him courage. Silas Thorne occupied a prominent spot near the base of the stairs, with the armed men behind him forming a kind of wall. When he saw Anna approach with the children and Joe beside her, a half-smile drew on his face, a mix of triumph and impatience. He believed the public exposure of his ex-daughter-in-law, trembling with fear before everyone, would have the effect of reinforcing his power, showing what happened to those who dared meddle in things he deemed his. What he didn't expect was to find in her gaze something different from that gleam of submission he had seen so many times on other faces. The priest, noting the approach, raised his hand, asking for silence. The square quieted down until only the rustling of clothes and some residual whispers could be heard. With a clear voice, he explained he had called everyone there because he could no longer allow what happened in the forgotten corners of the parish to remain restricted to corridors and murmurs. Said he had been informed there was a conflict involving ancient church property, promises made to the poor, and the situation of a family that had been the target of humiliations and threats. Added that if that was the house of God, then the square before it would be, that night, a place of truth. Anna felt her legs wobble for an instant, but the firm touch of Michael's hand in hers and Joe's solid presence beside her kept her standing. The priest invited her to climb a few steps so she could be heard by all. As she walked, she could feel the community's eyes weighing on her shoulders, some full of curiosity, others judgment, others a timid support that was still afraid to show itself. Getting close to the priest, she took a deep breath and, voice choked, began to tell the story from the beginning. She spoke of Jacob's death, the wake by candlelight, the colonel's coldness, the eviction, the closed doors, The humiliation at the church door when she sought help for her sick daughter and was almost stopped from entering for being considered a bearer of bad luck. As she related the facts, some faces in the crowd leaned forward as if wanting to hear better. People who had witnessed parts of that journey now saw them stitched into a single line, comprehending the weight of each gesture. Anna spoke of Joe standing up from the back pew, the offer of the shack behind the church, the strange noises in the stone walls, the crack, the first cloth sack, the coins and the paper. Next, with a quick gesture, Joe took Father Stephen's notebook and the first folded record from inside his shirt. Handed it to the priest in front of everyone, explaining that had been found hidden in the old chapel, in the same place where, according to legend, folks had died of hunger awaiting help that never came. The priest opened the notebook with trembling hands, immediately recognizing the handwriting of someone the parish memory guarded with distant respect. Elijah approached with a lantern, illuminating the pages where one could read, with painful clarity, the records of the saint. Michael's charity fund, donations in coins and objects, names of families, notes on migrants, widows, malnourished children. In a voice loud enough to reach even the farthest corners of the square, the priest began to read selected parts. First, passages describing the fund's purpose, the church's responsibility to guard those assets for the poor, the instruction that none of it should be used for private profit of influential persons. Then, almost unintentionally, his eyes were drawn to a denser note. There, Father Stephen recorded his frustration with a great benefactor who insisted on choosing who deserved or didn't deserve help, using charity as a bargaining chip for political obedience. There wasn't a clear name, but the description fit like a glove, the figure of someone everyone knew well. The reading stopped for an instant, and a tense silence set in. It was at this moment that Silas Thorne, with a hard smile, cut the mood, saying he was tired of old stories and yellowed paper, affirmed that even if all that were true, those stones, that land, and anything hidden there were under his influence since the time of his ancestors, and that he wouldn't allow a resentful widow and a landless carpenter to make him a villain in front of his own people. The square murmured. Some agreed with discreet gestures, too used to seeing the colonel as an incontestable figure. Others, however, began to shift differently. Old folks remembered their parents had spoken of donations made to an old priest in times of fierce drought. A lady with a colorful scarf from the middle of the crowd raised her voice and said her grandfather had told her that one day she would see the promised help arrive in the form of food and medicine, but he died, seeing nothing. A thin man, shoulders hunched, spoke up saying he remembered, still a boy, hearing women whisper about a priest who had vanished suddenly, right after saying he wouldn't let anyone die of hunger at the church door. Gradually, the murmurs began to gain body, forming a current of memories that had never had the courage to present themselves in the light. Perceiving that the balance of power in the square was beginning to shift, Joe stepped forward and, with the calm voice that characterized him, recounted what he had witnessed that first afternoon, the church door almost closing on a mother with a feverish daughter, Mrs. Eudora's harsh voice, the indifference of those who preferred obeying fear of the colonel over the commandment of charity. Said he wasn't there out of blind gratitude, nor to overthrow anyone, but because, since losing his own family in a flood, he had promised himself not to sit watching people left outside. Said that if that charity fund had been created for the poor of the frontier, then the time had come for it to finally fulfill its function, however late. Someone in the crowd shouted that this was nice to say, but asked who would guarantee those assets wouldn't simply change hands, leaving the colonel's control to fall into the hands of a few others. The question echoed like a sure arrow. Anna replied that if it depended on her, every aid would be recorded in a new notebook, with names, dates, and reasons, and that the people would have the right to follow along. Proposed right there impromptu, that a small group of people from the community be formed, women, simple men, perhaps a representative of the church, to decide together how the coins and resources would be used. Said she didn't want to be the owner of anything, just a temporary guardian of something that, in truth, belonged to everyone. The priest, touched both by the memory of his predecessor and the courage he saw right before his eyes, took a deep breath and took a side. Declared that while he was at the head of the parish, he would enforce the original intention of the St. Michael's Fund, suggested that part of the resources be used immediately to create a shelter and simple infirmary right there, behind the church, repurposing the walls of the old chapel and rebuilding what time and neglect had torn down. Another part could serve as a sort of revolving fund to help poor farmers buy seeds in the next planting season, with the commitment to return in grain when the harvest came, feeding a continuous cycle of solidarity. This proposal found an echo in many hearts. A lady raised her hand and offered to cook in the first weeks for whoever was sheltered. A young man said he could help with the work, carrying stone and clay. Elijah declared he would take responsibility for updating the new record book, noting everything with the same care he saw in the old notebook. Slowly, there formed in that square lit by lanterns the image of something no one there had dared dream. A truly community charity work, born not of humiliating alms, but of a reckoning with the past. Silas Thorne, seeing the tide turn, understood that insisting on force there could transform him, definitely, into everyone's enemy. The priest still held old Stephen's notebook, and the simple mention that that document could, if necessary, be taken to authorities in the capital, showed him a real risk to his reputation beyond the borders of the town. With teeth clenched, he swallowed his rage and, with the skill of someone who had spent a lifetime enacting generosity, declared he had nothing against seeing money used in the name of the poor, provided everything was done with order. Said that if they wanted, they could even put his name among the patrons of the new shelter as a continuation of the goodwill that, according to him, came from the family for generations. Many in the square saw in this gesture just another attempt to save his own image. Others, however, understood that even by crooked paths, a breach was opening. The important thing in that moment was that the colonel retreated from his initial intention to take the assets back in silence. Physical confrontation had been avoided, and even if he continued to be a powerful figure, the night of St. Benedict's crossing left a deep mark. Everyone had seen fear changing places, leaving the eyes of the weak to settle, even if for moments, in the posture of the strongest. In the months that followed, the old chapel behind the church began to transform before everyone. The stone walls were reinforced with new clay. The roof received firm tiles. Some small windows were opened to let air circulate. A simple porch was built in front, with a bench running along for those who needed to wait. Inside, makeshift beds with planks and straw mats made room for homeless widows, sick migrants and orphans, who before scattered in corners of charity. Anna assumed naturally a central role in that space, taking care of the kitchen, clothes and small daily mends. The hands that before only washed clothes to survive now served food, wiped wounds, stroked the hair of children crying for parents left behind on the roads. Joe Wright, in turn, became the living timber arm of that new house. He built beds, chairs, a long table for collective meals, shelves to store medicine and supplies. Organized work parties to fetch water from more distant sources, while little by little they began to think of ways to dig a closer well. With every board he nailed, he seemed to relieve an old weight from his own chest, as if finally he was giving something back to the world in the name of the wife and daughter taken by the flood. Anna's children began to run in the dirt courtyard with other children, no longer so marked by the loneliness of misery. Michael helped where he could, carrying small things, learning from Joe to sandwood to measure a gap. Rose, with health restored, decorated the place with rustic flowers picked by the roadside. The town, however slow, also modified itself. At first, many approached St. Michael's House, the name they began to use naturally, just to look from afar, suspicious. They thought it wouldn't last, that it was a matter of time until the colonel ordered everything closed. But as they saw people leaving better than they entered, children gaining weight, old folks having somewhere to lie without feeling the wind cut their bones, respect grew. Some of those who before repeated harsh words against Anna began to avoid her out of shame, while others found courage to apologize in almost inaudible murmurs, saying they had been blinded by fear. Silas Thorne himself, realizing the shelter was gaining prestige, tried to approach in a calculated way. Sent on a certain occasion a larger sack of beans, asking it be used in the name of the Albuquerque family. The priest Anna and the small group of fund guardians decided to accept the donation, noting it in the new notebook, and at the same time making clear aloud that any contribution would be recorded equally, coming from whoever it came, with the same value before God and the community. This delicate balance allowed the work to continue without direct confrontation, even though everyone knew that behind the scenes the colonel would never cease to resent having lost exclusivity over local charity. Sometime later, when the first rains finally fell with a bit more regularity, causing a timid green to sprout through the parched badlands, the impact of that decision made in the square began to appear in the fields too. Small farmers who received seeds and tools from the fund returned at the end of the harvest with sacks of grain to give back to the common stock, creating a cycle of trust that until then was unknown in St. Benedict's Crossing. The church, which one day almost closed its doors to a humiliated widow, came to be also the place where, from time to time, the priest read, at the end of Masses, excerpts from the new notebook, showing how the St. Michael's Fund was being used. That generated discussions, sometimes heated, but above all, it educated hearts to the idea that justice and mercy could walk together. Years passed. The marks of that September night in 1891 didn't disappear, but transformed into scars the town learned to touch with pride instead of shame. Anna's life went on, with new challenges and joys. The pain for what she had suffered was never totally erased, but mixed with a different peace, the certainty that she hadn't been just a survivor, but someone who, together with others, had changed the history of her place. The relationship with Joe Wright blossomed slowly, without fireworks. One day, without realizing when it started, they found themselves sharing not only work and worries, but also the comfortable silence of those who, sitting side by side at the end of a long day, know they don't need to explain anything else. Michael grew up helping at St. Michael's House, and later began to accompany the carpenter on short trips to neighboring towns, learning the trade, and at the same time carrying news that, in St. Benedict's Crossing, a charity fund had been unearthed from the stones to become a living work. Rose, who had arrived at that church almost fainting from fever, became a young woman with a steady gaze and skilled hands in the kitchen and caring for the sick. Often, it was she who received the new widows, sitting beside them on the mat, listening to stories of loss similar to her mother's and repeating in a soft voice that here no one would stay outside. On the late afternoon, many years later, when the calendar had already crossed the frontier of a new century, Anna walked slowly through the courtyard of St. Michael's House. Her hair had turned white in stubborn strands escaping her scarf. Her face bore lines marked by sun and worries, but her eyes held a calm shine. Around her, laughter of playing children could be heard, pots being stirred, someone singing softly an old tune. The church bell rang once, reminding of the time for another prayer. She raised her eyes to the tower, and for an instant the memory of the afternoon she was almost forbidden entry returned with force. She thought of everything that had happened since then, the man who stood up from the back pew, the crack in the stone wall, the coins, the notebook, the square full of people, the courage that was born right there where one day she had only felt shame. She smiled slightly with gratitude, not because life had turned into a fairy tale, but because, in that slice of the frontier, something really had changed. And because she knew, in the depths of her soul, that the true wealth hadn't been the unearthed metal, but the capacity to transform what was once hidden by fear into a source of shelter for many. Before entering the house again, she stopped at the simple gate that gave access to the dirt path. The sky was tinged a soft orange, and the wind brought the smell of wet earth from a recent rain, mixed with the aroma of coffee someone was straining in the kitchen. Anna closed the gate slowly, hearing the familiar creak of the wood. She thought that if God chose again where to start a work in that region, perhaps it wouldn't be by the highest house of the ranch, but by a small shack leaning against ruins, where a woman with nothing had found, in old stones and the hands of a silent man, the chance to rewrite her own destiny. If this story touched your heart, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and share with someone you love, because in every corner of this country there might be someone needing to remember that a closed door in a town church isn't the end of the road, if there is still a back pew from where someone is willing to stand up for us.